strategic sourcing and how it relates to performance excellence. So looking forward to it. Just some housekeeping terms. What we're gonna do is I'm gonna do a quick introduction, and then I'm gonna hand it over to the lady of the hour, Catherine, and she's gonna talk about for 20 minutes. Then we're gonna jump into Q&A. So we're gonna take all the questions. We're gonna try to answer as many as we can. And if for some reason we cannot get to your questions, we'll make sure that we will email you with a response within 24 to 48 hours, or to the best we can. But that's the format. Again, if any questions at any time, just ask a question and or email us too, and we'll have all our contact information in there as well. So let me give you a little bit overview. As you know, this webinar, of course, is hosted by us implementation engineers. We've been around for over 30 years. We are a performance excellence company, and essentially we partner with visionary leaders at organizations who are looking for a sustainable operating income impact. Over the years, we have consistently delivered long-term EBITDA growth for our clients through our expertise and sustainable implementation methodology. And there are a few areas that we really work in terms of all areas of performance excellence, like HCD, operations, manufacturing, metals, mining, supply chain, and many other areas as well. So today, what we have is we're gonna be talking about supply chain, which is one of the things. So I encourage everyone to go to our website, which is implementation.com/resources. We have a lot of free content, free resources available for everyone. So I do encourage, we have white papers, ebooks, many of the webinars we have done in the past. So it's all on demand, so you can watch it at your leisure. So that's a little bit about the introduction, but I'm really excited today to have Catherine Purdy as part of this webinar. So Catherine, welcome. Really looking forward to it. As I said, I looked at your slides earlier and some power-packed content for sure. But Catherine is the Vice President of Operations at Implementation Engineers, and she has been a recognized leader in lean manufacturing, Six Sigma process improvements. And I remember when we were doing a dry run for this webinar, Catherine, I saw all those black belts and green belts and all the trophies. So, you know your content really well, obviously. But you also have, Catherine also has 28 years plus in manufacturing, operations, and supply chain. She's an ERP implementation expert. She's certified in the industry, and some of her specialties, and Catherine, correct me if I'm wrong, but it's around automotive, aerospace and defense, transportation, telecom, finance, chemical. But Catherine, great to have you. I'm really looking forward to it, and I'm gonna hand it over to you. So it's all you. I'm gonna turn off my camera and come back at the end and take questions. So Catherine, once again, welcome and take it away. Thank you.
Okay, thanks so much, Bob. Thanks everybody for joining. I greatly appreciate it. A couple of things that we want to talk about today. If you've attended some of our other webinars, performance excellence is a lot of what we do. And so I want to take a few minutes to really talk about systems thinking and its role in performance excellence. And then also how that applies to supply chain. So we'll spend a few minutes there and talk through some of the pitfalls and idiosyncrasies between customer and supplier relationships, and then finally get to the topic of today, which is strategic sourcing for performance excellence. And specifically, we want to go into how we take a look at redefining value within the supply chain. We'll also cover building transparency and trust, how we accelerate results towards those performance excellence objectives, and then finally, how we can use supply chain as a competitive advantage. Next slide. So if we think about a system, I mean, the definition of a system is a ordered collection of items that exist to achieve some purpose. So if you think about it in terms of biology, and you have a circulatory system, it's a collection, it's the heart, it's the blood vessels, the arteries, all of those things that exist to deliver oxygen to the rest of the parts of the body. And it's very similar in business in that systems thinking means that we're applying that concept to a collection of business processes that have to work together to achieve a business function. So when we go into a company, one of the first things that we have to do is to diagnose what to fix. And using this systemic approach really helps us focus on how things work together to achieve that business function. And so some of the advantages are, first of all, it breaks down the complexity and it helps to identify the interdependencies between business processes. Secondly, it highlights a lot of the feedback loops that exist within processes or sometimes don't exist within business processes. But it really gets us out of kind of linear thinking into more circular and closed loop type thinking. The third thing and third advantage that systems thinking can bring is it helps to visualize cause and effect relationships. And to use another example, if we just think about our morning or your evening if you're a night shift person, a lot of us need caffeine or some kind of pick-me-up in order to wake up. But if you have too much or too late in the day, you can't sleep, it's hard to wake up, and then you need more coffee. And that kind of causality loop is so common actually in these business processes where we tend to, specifically we see it a lot in supply chain, get into this loop where specifically if we apply it to part shortages where there's this constant cause and effect loop coming into play. And what happens is you end up where you started. And you get to the point of, gosh, everything's interrelated. How do I know what to fix? And so the systemic approach helps to do all of these things and to help visualize these cause and effect relationships. It also enables us to prioritize. The fourth thing that systems thinking does is it tends to expose what we call silo-centric mentality or silo-centric management approach. Now, when we think about continuous improvement in business functions, a lot of times, we all have business plans, we may have strategic objectives, and we put plans in place within these departments or business functions to make things better. A lot of times what we find is the issue is that everybody's focusing on kind of an independent purpose, or they're focusing within their functional areas. And a lot of times you find that we optimize within the functional area, and conversely, we sub-optimize the entire process. So we see sometimes the silo-centric approach, and that's one of the advantages that systems thinking will give us. And finally, systems thinking, very consistent with lean, is it does measure the result of these interrelated processes or measure the value stream. So this is why we apply systems thinking to performance excellence. Now, when we think about how that applies to supply chain, next slide, please. So again, if we go back to our definition of a system, supply chain, right, is the collection of all of these business functions that work together to deliver materials and or resources from a vendor to a point of consumption. And the interesting thing is when we go into companies and we ask the question of who is supply chain, a lot of times we get the answer is, well, it's logistics, or sometimes it's purchasing or procurement. Other times it's actually the warehouse. And the answer to the question is that it's really everyone, because supply chain is a system. It's a lot larger than a business function. So what we do is we look at the collection of these processes holistically rather than independently to get an understanding of how they work together and what some of those operating constraints may be, as well as the independent things that need to be fixed. So, as we look through and talk about continuous improvement in general, focus now specifically within purchasing and supplier execution. It's very, very common when we walk into purchasing to say, what are we doing to drive continuous improvement within our supply base? And I will tell you 99% of the time, the answer is, well, we're constantly working on annual price reductions. And while that is good because, for most companies, 80 to 90% of the content or the value of the products that you sell are made up of, right, other items which can cost a lot of money. At the end of the day, being price centric is another way that things get sub-optimized. So what do I mean by that? Next slide, please.
Catherine, actually, let me jump in. Is when you show the slide, which is great, and when in your experience, does it apply to a specific industry, or is it industries agnostic, or you can apply it to a wide areas of not just companies but across industries? Just curious.
Yeah, so great question. To a certain degree, most industries have, well, first of all, supply chain is a system regardless. What's inside the circle or the oval there could be a little bit different depending on industries. I mean, some industries are much more transportation and logistics focused. Some are more more discrete manufacturing and assembly type focused, highly engineered components where there's a very large engineering degree or engineering piece of that. So I think what's inside could change to some degree, or the importance of each one of those could change depending on the kind of industry you are. However, the concept applies regardless of the industry that you're in.
Great. Thank you. Thank you.
You're welcome. So we talked a little bit about price and the focus on annual price reductions, okay? We all know who Warren Buffett is, very successful, but I think this is a really compelling quote because it ties into this system thinking. Price is what you pay, but value is what you get. And value is really what we're after in supply chain. And one of the things that we want to constantly do is understand what not only delivers value, but let's really define what that value is. So next slide, please. So when we talk about systemically redefining value, if we think about the stages of a relationship between a customer and a supplier, obviously we have to engage the supplier, maybe certify them to some degree. If there is a design component, we may have to engage in some kind of engineering type function. Or even if it's not engineering, sometimes that's just more packaging and delivery strategy and structure. Then, of course, there's the procurement piece. Then there's usually a large support piece as well, everything from supporting from a compliance perspective, from EDI, warranty, things like that. And then finally, there's all those delivery characteristics, which are pretty common when it comes to supplier management, where we're trying to focus on making sure that the delivery and the timing and is basically getting parts and services where they need to be on time. Now, the chevrons up top, whether your organization has them in a slightly different order, for the most part, there are some business processes that are basically that can be put into each one of these categories. So what we have across the top below the chevrons is we actually have what we call the touch points, all the different pieces of the organization that at some point have to engage with the supplier. And what we have down the left hand side is we actually have the business functions that do that. And a lot of times you find that it's a one-to-many relationship, not only within the business functions that have to achieve an objective, but a lot of times it can be a back and forth relationship as well. And so this is just an example of the number of touch points that can exist in an organization throughout this life cycle with a supplier. The interesting thing is if we go back to can you go back to the last slide, please? The interesting thing here is if you think about price is really around, procurement and the price you want to pay. But value is basically defined as all of these other touch points within the organization. And my question to a lot of you would be, what value do you place on the supplier who basically gets all these things done, who you don't have to manage, who's very reliable, who constantly is there for you no matter what the business condition. And unfortunately, focusing a lot of times on price, you don't necessarily get that definition of value. Okay, so next slide, please. As we have engaged with our customers, one of the things that we do when we go into supply chains is we poll our customers and say, what do you need out of the relationship with your supply base? And the answer to what customers need, these are the five most commonly mentioned items. Customers need competitiveness within their supply base. They need flexibility. They need cost transparency, honesty, and of course, these annual reductions. Now, the interesting thing is when we work with supply bases, we actually ask that same question and say, what do you need out of the relationship with your customer? And what the supply base needs is they want growth opportunities. They want consistency in schedules and in requirements and in demands. They need profitability. They don't need the customer to tell them how much they can be profitable. They know what their business plans are, and they need their own description or definition of profitability. They also need some integrity within that relationship within their supply base, knowing that as you open up and build some transparency, that it's not going to come back, to bite you. So integrity is very important. And a lot of times it's step changes that match the supplier's continuous improvement cycle. So when we actually take these and we put them together and we map them out, what we find is that we've got these competing expectations that in some cases are very much 180 degrees from one another. And what we have found as we explore these relationships is that these kinds of conflicting behaviors due to these diametrically opposed needs actually can cause mistrust and distrust within an organization. And so one of the things that we recognize is that if we truly want to get to our end goal, which is having supply chain be a competitive advantage, is that we have to build trust, and we have to change those behaviors that are inhibiting trust. Next slide, please. So we actually have, and I know this is very difficult to see, we're going to expand it out in a little bit so you can see it with much more clarity. What we actually have is a performance excellence model. It's a 20-step process that works to do two things. First of all, build trust within the supply base between the customer and the supplier. Create that win-win relationship and enable us to collectively as a team move from being price-centric to value-centric and taking into account all of those different touch points that exist within the organization. So let's expand this out a little bit. Next slide, please. So strategic sourcing for performance excellence emphasizes the goals of the partnership. And it's very easy from a customer perspective to say, hey, we want your 1.5% cost reductions every year. But at the end of the day, in order to achieve that, a lot of times the suppliers say, well, okay, we can do that, but here's what we need in return. And a lot of times that dialogue either doesn't exist or it can be kind of one-sided or even in some cases slightly skewed. So in this process, the first two steps really focus on building integrity and trust within the relationship. So aligning and partnering. This is about, first of all, choosing the suppliers who are open to this kind of engagement, and then mobilizing the organizations to change. Because when we talk about changing behavior, we're talking about changing people, and we're talking about changing expectations. So this is the first thing that we do. The second thing is, we have to engineer this partnership for the long term. And by engineering this partnership, we're looking at what are the things that not only are barriers to trust, but how can we build and collaborate together and generate speed. And the speed is in speed to change, speed to improvement, speed to value, and to achieving that value. Next slide, please. Okay, so building transparency and trust. Again, as we have worked with our customers and our suppliers and done a lot of supply chain projects, one of the things that we found, and this comes back to those diametrically opposed expectations, is that when you don't have shared purpose, when each partner in the relationship has independent purposes, then what that leads to is a lot of the symptoms that you see in business effectiveness. or business ineffectiveness, I should say. Things like unpredictable schedules or unpredictable delivery, squeezed margins, business compromises, capacity constraints, sometimes long cycle times or even long decision-making cycle times. So at implementation engineers, go ahead and click, please. At implementation engineers, what we work and what those first two pieces of this process deliver is shared purpose that enables better understanding of your cost, and therefore once you understand those costs, you can achieve cost control. So by having this shared purpose, now we can basically generate improvements much more quickly and effectively and collaboratively, an on-time delivery, quality, return on investment, innovation. You know, once you have this very open and collaborative environment where you can share and have shared purpose, share information, and you have shared purpose, we find that the innovation and the solutions, not only in the design, but in the supply chain itself, become very much, so much more achievable. Next slide, please. So that's just the start, you know, and it's very interesting in this four-pillared process, as we mentioned. You know, if we don't spend some time engineering this relationship, it's very common to want to go in, demand price reductions, and we focus on pure execution. And that is fine. You know, the issue is, you know, we want to get to continuing to build trust and opening doors that aren't necessarily open today. Because this is really about not just redistributing the value that exists in the supply chain, but it's about finding that new value, doing the touch points analysis, building that open relationship where you can be collaborative. Then we can execute and sustain much more efficiently and effectively. Through some of our other webinars, we've talked about our three-pronged approach, which is people, process, systems, and everything that we do. So not only just business systems, but again, there's knowledge management systems, there's data systems, there's systems like supply chain that exist all over the business. And we take a look at how all of those pieces have to work together and collectively to, again, deliver value and understand where those non-value added costs are. So finally, evolving and growing. It's not just about doing this process once, but it's about in this relationship constantly reinforcing the behaviors that basically allow respect and trust to grow, and making sure that we are constantly monitoring that, but also repeating the success and making sure that we have this infrastructure to do that, both from an operational standpoint, but also from a human capital perspective. And so this last pillar really involves how we as people grow, and how we can basically enhance our own leadership and talent pool capabilities. And as we do that, that helps us, you know, kind of guide through this long-term process, this long-term partnership that allows us to deliver and execute over and over and over again. This is also about expanding the partnership and to make sure that, you know, we may have started this process with a few key suppliers, but it's about taking what works and taking that mentality and driving that into your culture and the way you deal with your suppliers consistently and over the long term. So to summarize, strategic sourcing for performance excellence. It does a number of things, but first and foremost, it develops long-term partnerships with suppliers. And as we develop that relationship and we build trust, we're able to redefine value systemically across the value stream, looking at all of the parts of the system holistically rather than independently. It allows us, again, to eliminate those behaviors that are basically inhibiting trust, and to re-engineer what both parties need out of the relationship. It also drives the cost-centric rather than, or I would say value-centric behaviors rather than just price-centric decision-making, and allowing us to say, you know, yes, price is one thing, but if we look at the cost of all of those touch points across the organization, we realize that there's a lot more value that needs to be not only understood, but fundamentally capitalized on when we're entering this relationship. And this is about executing win-win strategies and being innovative together so that we can be competitive. And when we are able to do all of these things and able to repeat our success, then what we've done is we've actually built a supply chain that together we have shared purpose, and we can be competitive together. And as we do that, that allows us to really say, this relationship isn't just a discrete agreement to deliver components or resources. It is a true partnership. And that's where the win-win relationship comes in.
That was great, Catherine. I think you had some great content. Sorry, I was just asking questions in between. But before we get into the formal questions from everyone, I have a couple of questions. So I think one of the question as I was writing down is you talked about building trust between suppliers. So what are some of the best practices? I mean, you mentioned, but what are some of the best practices in terms of communications, between suppliers and partners that you have seen that has worked really well?
Yeah. So it's the kind of things that we actually do in any process to begin with is the first thing you have to do is you have to establish that shared purpose and the goals and the vision, and you have to understand what those things are. And the next set is you have to diagnose what isn't working today and where there's some concerns within the relationship. And that may start with the relationship between sales and purchasing, but that gets extended through all of these different touch points. And so as we start building trust, we have to understand where there are these barriers throughout the organization. So that is one of the key areas that we do. And that's what happens when we're engineering this relationship for the long term.
Nice, very nice. I see a question that's just come in, so I'm gonna ask this. But have you seen, Catherine, a typical, I'm sure like nothing is typical, but what is a typical time frame for implementing and building this supply chain relationship, trust and things? So I think, have you seen any typical time frame, like you can get done 6 months, 1 year, or is it, how does it work?
Well, trust takes time, right? And the interesting thing is a lot of times, and I think most of you know that, trust is something that's earned. So to put a time frame on it, I first of all will say it depends on the size of the organization. It depends on the complexity of the supply chain, as well as the number of touch points. The more touch points you have, the longer it is going to take. I would say this is a minimum of 1 year to really even understand, the touch points and begin to engage in the dialogue on how to systemically improve holistically and together. The executing, you can start to work on continuous improvement processes, and that actually leads me to another point in that even though we've drawn this linearly, some of these pieces can begin to happen in parallel. However, we have to be very careful about that transparency piece and how that occurs if we haven't yet built trust.
Great, great. I do have a follow-up question on that. But folks, if you have any other questions around supply chain performance, please email us at info@implementation.com or call us. And, there are a lot of free resources on our website as well. But Catherine, a follow-up to this question that I was just asked is, what is your typical process? Like, let's say you go in on a client side or plant. So what is the process? If you can quickly walk through. From a month one onwards.
Okay, so there is an upfront piece in working with the customer in this particular case. You have to identify from a long-term perspective who are the suppliers that you want to grow together with. So that's one of the first pieces that you have to do. Then from there, you have to engage those suppliers in that dialogue to say, here's what we're interested in. But as we're going to engineer this relationship, there's going to be gives and takes on both sides. And what we're going to do is learn a lot about ourselves, holistically as a company, what we do well, what we don't do well. We use a combination of surveys, workshops, all sorts of diagnostic tools in a process where we understand one another, and then we come back and review. We highlight those gaps. We build processes in a combination of leadership and people development processes to start to build that trust. Now, on the technical side as well, as we engineer this relationship and we start to improve, then in the execute and sustain, that's where we're going into manufacturing processes or maybe other pieces of supply chain. Sometimes it's accounting processes. And remember, all of these touch points, value is across the organization. And what we do is we begin to apply some of the common as well as some of the more innovative process improvement techniques to improve these business processes.
Great, great. So, Catherine, I know we run out of time, but I see tons of questions. But I have one question, so I'm going to take this one last question, if you don't mind. But I think the question is, you showed us the linear process about align and all those things, ASEE, I believe. Um, what have you seen? What are the typical roadblocks? And if for example, you mentioned that trust takes longer to build, this lifelong in most cases, but have you seen some roadblocks, and some things you can get it done faster, and then there are these big roadblocks, and then that takes away more time? um,
Well, so the interesting thing is trust. A lot of times when you're trying to build trust, you really need a third party person to basically facilitate the relationship. Because if it is in fact facilitated by one or the other party, a lot of times you don't fully get that give and take relationship. And so I would say one of the barriers is being open to um, listening, as well as understanding the gaps within your own organization and how you need to change, and being able to truly be committed to doing that. However, what we have seen is when you get the suppliers who can do this and work together, um, it is truly amazing. And the amount of innovation, and gosh, the cost savings, and when we're talking about value, they come from places that are very non-traditional. And other touch points within the organization. And so that being said, there's going to be barriers. Every company is going to be a little bit different, but at the end of the day, I think the biggest thing is if people can and parties can agree that yes, we want to do this for the long term. The benefits totally outweigh the barriers.
This is great. Thank you so much. And folks, again, if you have a question, please email us, call us, and of course, it's implementation.com/resources, where you can find all kinds of webinars, white papers, case studies, thought leadership pieces on our website. But Catherine, this was great. Thank you so much. I can keep
Thank you.
asking you questions all day long, but I know you got a jet, so I'm going to stop right here. And this was great. Thank you so much for your time, and looking forward to doing this again. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Bye.
All right. Thank you, folks. This was great. And thank you again for joining. And